Welcome, everybody, to our afternoon session. I'm glad that so many of you made it here and that you share our great interest in this fascinating topic about digitalization and the future of work. We have an excellent panel here. I won't introduce all of them immediately, but as we go along in the program. And let me just say that for us at the OECD, this is an extremely important topic on which we're doing a lot of work. And normally I would have given you maybe 2 or 3 little factoids from our work, but I was delighted to discover that one of our speakers actually is using OECD data in the presentation. So, and you know, it's much better to have somebody else tell you about our nice work than us advertising our own work. So I'm very grateful to Heather, who's going to use some of our data, and I'm sure she'll do a great job of presenting this. What we're going to do in this session here today, and I think we have a very nice combination of different presentations, we're going to start with an overview of the key issues, which will be provided by Bernice Ang. And then we will continue with a more detailed look at well-being, which is obviously the key issue here. And then we will follow up with policy in 2 country examples, in the UK and in Korea. What are governments actually doing about this, and how are they trying to ensure that all of these changes in the new world of work will be accompanied by increased rather than diminished well-being. So without further ado, let me present our first speaker. And this is the first time in my life that I am presenting somebody with this job title. We have, as the first speaker, Bernice Ang, who is the chief alchemist. Chief alchemist. Isn't that a wonderful, wonderful job description? From Zeroth. Zeroth is a systems mapping startup in Singapore that helps governments and cities to look at how different phenomena are mapped together, how they relate to each other, and where governments or city planners or policymakers in general have to look in order to make sure that they're addressing the right phenomena in the right order. So without further ado, Bernice, the floor is yours, and we look forward to your presentation.
See if this works. Okay. Hi, everyone. So this is a topic that, from my perspective, has been talked to death, but I don't know where everyone is. So can I just have a show of hands? Who has gone to some panel or conference or seminar on the future of work? Oh, okay. That's a surprisingly low number, so that's good. So this is like mostly fresh information. Excellent. So I'm going to skip the basics on what AI is, because you're all brilliant people who can Google. So there's a lot of anxiety, right, about the future of work. And people are saying a lot of different things. Some of them are conflicting each other. But a lot of it is that there's going to be this massive wave of robots taking over our jobs. But the thing is, if you think about it, technological change has happened many times before. I mean, the history of the Homo sapiens species is littered with different waves of technological change, revolutions. So what's different this time? Oh, I need the clicker. Okay, so first of all, it's to do with numbers. So let's compare the advent of the internet with the advent of AI. In 1979, you have General Motors with about more than 800,000 workers, and that says tens of thousands, but it was about 800,000, and earning 11 billion in 1979. In 2012, Google, with a workforce of 50,000 plus people, earns 14 billion. And then, let's look at this one. In 1998, we clocked 194 billion hours worked. So this is American data, because it's the most readily available. And then in 2013, we see a productivity from automation of 42%. That is huge. But guess how many hours were worked? Would anybody like to take that call? Okay, so it was the same. It was 194 billion hours worked. Right, so the key thing here is that even with massive productivity, which from then you expect more labor employment, you do have thousands more companies being set up and millions more people in the workforce, but the hours worked did not change. So the big thing that's happening here is a big decoupling of productivity from human labor. So that kind of contradicts how we understand productivity to work in terms of increases in human labor. A future hypothetical job landscape. And here is a photo of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the new House representative for New York. And this was her previous job, bartending. And so this is half a joke and half not a joke, because there's going to be a bifurcation. At least I believe that we will see a bifurcation in the type of jobs that are available. So on one hand, you have internet and AI-enabled businesses. So some of them you already know. Companies like Uber, Airbnb, podcasts like Vox, and like a whole bunch of different kinds of companies that are possible only because of the internet. Right, so you will have more of these, but then the same way Airbnb had no predecessor before it and Uber didn't have a predecessor before it, there will be other businesses and new industries being created as well that use the internet to make this work, or to have those businesses. Right, and on the other hand, you'll also have, oh, sorry, I'm a couple slides behind. Yes, this was the fun Wreck-It Ralph internet industries, and so here are all our familiar names: WhatsApp, Spotify, Twitter. Yes, businesses that were only possible because of the internet. And then you also, on the other hand, have high-touch jobs like social workers, DJs, and bartenders, concierges. These kinds of jobs where people still want a human interface to have the function done. And then the problem with this is that how many bartenders does society need? Right, so this is a numbers issue. The number of jobs that will be displaced does not match the niches for super talented DJs and very cool bartenders to fill. And so then there's this idea of service labor jobs. So caregivers, people who might walk a granny to visit a doctor, youth mentors, even household maintenance. So, I'm getting into like a speculative area here now, but notice that a lot of these tasks are work that has been invisible and emotional labor done by women, mostly, that has not been compensated in the market. Right, so interestingly, we might see a shift actually to these kinds of jobs and tasks becoming recognized. So near-term implications. For companies, those that make AI and those that use AI are going to get very, very rich, even richer than they are now. This is actually supposed to be an animated GIF. I made this in the PDF so you don't see the guy spinning in money. And for the economy, we see a very not nice graph. So this is the famous chart from the New York Times that showed what is broken in our economy with one simple graph, and it's basically how times have changed so dramatically. In 1980, you have this kind of a percentile distribution, and then in 2014, just 4 years ago, we see this kind of crazy spike up here just for the 1%. This is almost, I think, literally 1%, 2 percentile, right? So it's a massive change in the nature of the distribution of income growth. And in fact, if you look at the end, there's like, it dips into the negative. So if you're having less wages, even with the 2 jobs or the 3 jobs that you work, this is not a good sign. But then this is what our economy is pointing towards. Let me see. Okay, and for workers, the picture, so it's as what I alluded to just now, it doesn't look pretty, but especially for low to middle kind of a bucket of jobs, low to middle end bucket of jobs. Like at the top end, you'll still have your designers and your creatives, And at the bottom end, you actually might still have like cleaners and these kind of menial tasks that are more difficult for the mechanics of robots at the current stage to do. So you get a lot of this sort of hollowing out of the middle that is most easily automated. So then if we look just slightly over the next horizon, mid to longer term implications. Some of you have probably seen a lot of retraining programs, upskilling programs. In Singapore, we have an entire agency set up to do Skills Future. That's what it's called, Skills Future, one word. There's a lot of interesting courses, including flower arrangement or something like that, which was apparently the most popular course this past year on Skills Future. Very interesting. And then so in service labor jobs, as I mentioned, the big question with that is who will pay for that? So presumably governments who, this is the kind of thing that the government needs to step up and do. But then can they do this? Because the workforce that they relied on before would have massively shrunk. And so the countries that host AI companies will be the ones that are able to do this. Right now, there are two, America and the US. I'm not sure if there will be more, but the network effects of the AI industry suggest that it will stay at two, if not less. And this is because of the way the AI ecosystem is set up. It creates these ever-strengthening feedback loops, so that the more data you have, the more users you acquire, the more talent you can hire, and the more economic power you have to negotiate with other services and utilities like telcos to provide things that you don't want to pay for, like what Apple and AT&T, like what Apple did, such that AT&T had to provide more infrastructure to house the data, the massive new data that was being created, right? And then the more economic power, the more data again, and the cycle continues. It's a virtuous cycle, although not the most virtuous. So in systems and complexity science, there's a phrase we use that's called increasing returns. Right? Instead of decreasing returns, these are positive feedback loops, so they strengthen the more and the more the other things strengthen. And this brings us a new demographic challenge, because the people who used to be productive, good units of labor, now many of them will be out of work and reliant on state support. And as I mentioned, the tax base would have shrunk, and so there's a whole new level of a dependency ratio that we'll be grappling with. And so tax, as I mentioned, like the tax-paying base would have shrunk, and this means that we'll need to rethink social protection policies, whether they are universal basic income or something else. This is a question that governments can no longer ignore. So next, AI is GPT. So GPT is general purpose technology. Why did I put this here? This is my final and biggest point. Right, the problem for many governments grappling with this is that this is not just an employment issue. It's not just an education issue. It's not just an industry development issue. Right? It's not even just a private sector regulation issue. It's that the cross-cutting effects of AI impact all manner of technological, social, and economic dimensions of society. And this makes it characterizable potentially as a general purpose technology. So think the internet, or if you go back further, electricity. Right? These are things that when introduced, they changed all of society, all of life, as we know it. And so something that we will need to ask moving forward and grapple with is, one is a very big disconnect between these cascading effects that I have described, which are dynamic and emergent, but this is not congruent with the kind of linear, gradual decision-making and operating processes of government, not to mention the silos that they operate in. And so what we need is a different way or paradigm of navigating these complex adaptive systems. And I will stop on that note. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bernice, also for staying in the time so well. That was perfect. And I think that we got a good overview of the complex challenges. And thank you also for mentioning social protection, which as the head of social policy at the OECD is obviously very close to my heart. We will follow now with some exploration of what all of this means for well-being. And we have a great speaker on this. It's Jan Emmanuel de Neve. Jan is from Belgium. He's an economist and specialized in the economics of well-being. He's currently a professor of economics at the University of Oxford. And very importantly, he is the editor of the World Happiness Report, which comes out every year in March and which has made countries very much alert and aware of the question of happiness as it ranks countries. And the country ranking is, of course, something that we at the OECD also know very well. That's when people start getting really active, when they find out, why am I on the top? Why are they on the top, usually? And why am I so far below? So Jan Emmanuel, it's great to have you, and we look forward to your insights on well-being and digitalization.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction, but credit where credit is due. I'm an associate editor of the World Happiness Report, and it's the very senior economists, Jeffrey Sachs, John Halliwell, and Richard Lehut, who've founded it in 2012, and I'm just really, really glad to be able to contribute a little bit to the success and the importance of the World Happiness Report, I would argue. So as you kindly noted, Monica, it's especially at this forum, when we talk about the future of work and digitization, quickly then the question arises, well, what will this mean for the well-being of individuals and societies at large? And so I knew that this question would come up here as well, and so I thought, given that most of my research is on well-being and work, I thought I'd try and provide a systematic approach to try and have us think through the impact that the digitalization and future work may have on well-being. And if I think about this, I was once told that there's two kinds of economists. There's those that know that they can't predict the future, and there's those economists that don't know that they cannot predict the future. And so I need to be very careful in terms of predicting and hypothesizing about the future. So the best place to start, I would argue, is about what drives employee well-being today, to look carefully at these drivers and their relative importance, and then not speculate, but build on very recent research about how digitization, automation, AI, and ICT revolutions tend to impact these specific drivers more or less, and then try and have sort of an evidence-based prediction around what the likely overall impact will be on employee well-being and why that matters, because there's some new and fascinating research on why it matters for a number of reasons, not just well-being in and of itself, but also on the productivity that it may show. And I think we're starting to see the beginnings of this revolution, or this revolution of digitization on well-being. We're starting to see the beginnings of that in the global data, and it's potentially worrying, as you'll see, and I want to leave that to the very last slide. Okay, what drives employee well-being? Well, what we've done is published this year, I think the largest study to date, looking at the drivers of job satisfaction and employee engagement by looking at a major international data set with granular level data on specific aspects of people's job. And so these 12 characteristics that you see here to my right or to my left range from pretty much cover everything. So how much people are paid, how many hours that they work, the mismatch in skills, work-life balance, imbalance, whether this is a difficult job in terms of physical stress and danger, whether they find there's career opportunities, you name it. The quality of the social relations on the job, all of these aspects we've got data for, and we link that to how they feel about the job, so job satisfaction and engagement measures. If we had more time, I'd pause here and I'd ask you to see what you think is most important to you or your organization, or what you think, but obviously we do not, I'm afraid, have that time, so I'll skip that sort of interaction and go straight to the results, which are the following. So what you're seeing here is the confidence intervals. Looks like the middle points have left the PDF. But that should still be indicative enough. So what you're seeing is that all things matter, but some things matter more than others. And so if we start thinking about pay, which for a neoclassical economist would still be the baseline for what drives people's job satisfaction, is the paycheck associated with it, well, it is not unimportant. So pay matters in terms of driving job satisfaction. But the interesting thing here is that it's other elements, non-pecuniary elements, such as the quality of the social capital on the job, the interpersonal relations, that matter even more, finding the job useful, and the job security around it matter as much, and in the case of interpersonal relations, an interesting job, even more, twice as much in fact, as pay. So that's important. If we use this as a baseline, and then think about, okay, how is digitization in the future work going to impact these particular elements of job characteristics, then we can think about it in the following way. And if we read the recent literature, the empirical literature about how the beginnings of digitization are starting and automation are starting to move the needle on a number of fronts, based on that reading of a number of pieces that I'll run you through briefly, I would summarize them as follows. Amongst the drivers of job satisfaction, I think on a positive front, we'll see increases in independence, or autonomy as it's often called in the literature. I think it will allow for better work-life balance. There's a lot more opportunities for working from home and flexi time. There will be a better skills match, I would argue, on a number of fronts. Potential for feedback through AI and more clever ways of pulsing people and giving them a sense of agency in how work is run. So there's new ways of interacting with managers and being part of decision-making. And very clearly, I think, pay for the highly skilled individuals, and this will be an important difference, pay for highly skilled individuals is likely going to be positively impacted. On the negative front, job security for a large chunk of people will be put under pressure, as will be pay for low and medium skilled individuals, which we've seen through robotization, and we're seeing the beginnings of digitization putting pressure on people low and medium skilled training. And I also believe, and I'll show you a fantastic piece of evidence for it on the next slide, that interpersonal relations will become less, there will be less potential for good quality in terms of interpersonal relations. So social capital on the job, I think, will be undermined as we see the gig economy isolate individuals much more, and there's some evidence for that. So let me run you through 3 fantastic new research papers by colleagues at Oxford and the LSE that I think allow me to say and split the positives and the negatives. But if you want my subjective impression of the overall sense for how this is likely to influence the well-being of workers, the future of work that is, then even though I've put less items on the negative front, you'll notice that they're more associated with the ones that are most important in driving job satisfaction. So the social isolation, pay for low and medium skilled workers coming down is likely to, because it weighs more heavily in the equation of job satisfaction, given that those will be put under pressure, I'm afraid to say that in my modest opinion, on balance, I think well-being will be negatively impacted through digitization for the majority of people. Okay, so why do I say that? Well, because of fantastic new working papers that have come out in the last year, because the 3 papers I'll mention are all essentially 2018, and one is to be published in 2019, so it's as recent as it gets. So this is a fantastic study by colleagues at Oxford that have studied, empirical study of essentially, again, gig workers, and what they find is, no surprise, the good and bad aspects to it. On the one hand, more autonomy, as the title indicates, but if you read the abstract in the actual paper, you'll also see evidence for social isolation of this kind of new algorithmic type of work. The interesting here is that a lot of people's bosses are essentially becoming algorithmic platforms. And so the social isolation that follows from it, including also very strange working hours and sleeplessness, are the kinds of negative impact that they seem to pick up from these first ventures into this kind of work. Equally recent, and on a similar subject, a fantastic new paper has just come out, was presented for the first time last month, on the actual administrative data of Uber in London. So they have all the data of all Uber drivers in London, and compare, for the first time in my, to the best of my knowledge, the first time that Uber drivers, who've been studied for a while now, but their life satisfaction and their negative emotions are coming into play and are being evaluated. And what these authors find is that, generally speaking, There's higher levels of anxiety amongst essentially gig workers, of which Uber drivers are obviously the quintessential example. So across the board, anxiety levels are higher amongst Uber drivers than they are amongst other self-employed individuals controlling for the type of socioeconomic status and income. The only positive to be remembered from this paper is that if you split the sample up in people who like the autonomy aspect, then there's a slight increase in life satisfaction. If you look at the people who who are not interested in the autonomy flexibility aspect of being an Uber driver, then it's lower life satisfaction. But across the board, both of these groups do see an increase in anxiety. And you'll see some of this pick up later as well. A third paper that allowed me to kind of try and come up with, on balance, a negative is this one. And this is the one that I think a lot of people will be referring to. Fantastic work by very senior colleagues at the LSE, including John van Rienen, that shows, in line with a number of other empirical studies, that there seems to be polarization in the demand for specific sets of skills in these technological revolutions. To put it much more simple, people with highly skilled individuals are much more likely to benefit from this than people with mid and low levels of skills. Depending on whether it's robotization, and automation, or ICT, more digital type, it depends whether it's low or medium skilled people that are most at risk. But generally, it helps the top end of the skill levels, and that obviously drives inequality, if you will, polarization in wages. But on a positive note, if you will, a lot of people are scared of the useless class or larger numbers of unemployed. That's not what this kind of empirical research seems to indicate. So we're not necessarily seeing a reduction in employment or an increase in unemployment because of these changes in technology through these technological cycles. So employment seems relatively safe, but there's lots of pressure being put on people in low and medium skilled individuals in terms of what they earn in turn for their work. So these three, I think, big papers allow us to point in the direction that, on balance, it's probably not looking good in terms of the impact on well-being, except for the happy few. Why am I worried about this? Because this is brand new work that we're doing that is not published yet. It's an experimental study where we've brought in a few hundred students into the lab. We have them play games, make some money, but we manipulate artificially the levels of pay inequality between individuals. So think of the pay polarization that we're likely going to see through digitization in the future of work, and put this together in a group, in an organization, where people suddenly are making much more and others making much less. What we're finding is something very interesting that ties in pay inequality to well-being to productivity. What we're finding is it reduces people's motivation to work, this inequality. And that's even for the people that are on top, or the winners out of the system. And part of that relationship is driven, or mediated, as we'd say, through well-being. So we find this really powerful triangle that essentially shows the price of inequality. So I know we've heard a lot of Joe Stiglitz in the last 2 days. He's got this wonderful book called The Price of Inequality. Well, it looks like the price of inequality is paid in low happiness and low willingness to work. That's what we find in this experimental causal study, which we've submitted for publication. And that's a great segue into thinking about a following aspect of the impact of the future of work on people as a whole is, and it doesn't get enough attention, is if it, on balance, reduces the well-being of employees, the future of work employees, then that will also have impact on productivity. And it's something that is not fully grasped, I think, or fully understood by policymakers, that if we don't deal with this now or in the future, then there may also be these negative spillover effects on productivity itself. Let me, for the sake of going very quickly, just note that there is a strong and causal relationship between employee well-being and productivity. So we've got experimental evidence from the lab that shows that a standard deviation change in well-being is related to 7 to 12% increase in productivity. We're running field experiments at the moment that replicate this in a large context of call center employees that find very similar on a number of performance metrics. This is not just at the individual level, it's also at the firm level. This is work that we'll be publishing in 2019, where we've leveraged the Gallup client database for the very first time. What you're seeing here is the result of more than 2 million employee engagement surveys across 70 countries and I don't know how many thousands and thousands of work units in firms across all kinds of industries, looking into how employee engagement correlates with the most important performance metrics. So if the future of work, on balance, is negative for employee well-being and engagement, we'll pick up, this will negatively impact, there will be a negative spillover effect on firm performance and individual productivity. So something to keep in mind, and not something that I'm seeing picked up as the impact of future of work in most reports so far. So why does all of this matter? Well, because there's a certain value of happiness, but I'll skip this in the interest of time. What I don't want to skip is the final slide. What we're seeing, and this is really, there's a sense of urgency to this, because we talk about the future of work, but the future of work has started. And if you look at these data, I think it is partially due to the future of work having started that we're seeing this. I was asked to comment on this for some newspapers. This is a Gallup report about their negative experience index, which comes out their wonderful Gallup World Poll, which asks people about how whether the degree to which they're experiencing anxiety and stress and sleeplessness and these kind of negative experience aspects, which they put together into a negative experience index. And since 2010, so this is against the backdrop of an improving economic situation, we've seen a quantum leap increase in the experience of negative emotions around the world in general, and this is obviously in some places even more than in others. And this is scary. This is very scary. Because for a lot of us, the things are going well, stock market is up, our jobs are well protected, and we're getting paid well. But for most people, it seems that there's negative emotions are on the rise. Why is this also very scary? Not just because we care about the feelings of other people and it doesn't look good, but also because Monica and I were talking earlier, there are behavioral effects of this. Subjective well-being has objective outcomes. And one of these is politics, for example. So you already saw the effect on productivity, but one other impact of changes in subjective well-being is how it makes people feel and how that then translates in voting. And so we're now really digging into fantastic data on the degree to which changes in subjective well-being predict changes in voting behavior, including Brexit or Trump in the United States, and across multiple elections. To what extent is our change in well-being reflective of people vote? And it may not come as a surprise, but we have a paper that we've just submitted with the title, Unhappiness Predicts Trump Voting. And I've never seen such a robust correlation. So on that fantastic happy note, maybe I should close. So sorry again for the great sense of urgency, but I think the future of work has started, and we're seeing the, on balance, relatively negative impact on an increase in negative emotions. Okay, over to other people like Heather to hopefully strike a slightly more positive note.
Thank you so much, Jan. That was it was wonderful to see how these, even if it's scary, but it really does show that there is data to these perceptions that we're all having and that we're seeing in elections around the world. And I think it's very important to always keep in mind what you said, even if we don't expect maybe such a large impact on the aggregate employment, what's very important is what goes on in sectors, what goes on in regions, and as you said, what matters to people in their jobs, the identification with your professional activity and pay. I mean, how can you explain to somebody who had a manufacturing job and made a lot of money in that job that yes, there's lots of caring jobs out there, but how much are they going to get in that caring job? And somebody who was very much identifying with being a miner or an automotive worker, being a nurse is not going to carry the same type of prestige. And it's interesting, we're seeing more and more countries coming to the OECD now, asking us also about what good examples are out there in the world to attract and retain staff in caring jobs. And one of them is going to be pay and work conditions. That's absolutely clear. But how, and that's what Bernice also said, who is going to pay for this? So I'm looking forward to the discussion, because let's not forget that the future of work is not only the work on platforms and the digital work, but it's also the very analog work of old type jobs that have always been there and which we're going to need more of, for example, in the caring sectors. Now, we're going to dig down deeper into these issues of regional differences and what happens in the world of work with our next speaker. Heather Carey is Deputy Director of the Work Foundation. The Work Foundation is a UK think tank focused on future of work issues. It's part of the University of Lancaster Management School. And Heather is going to tell us more about the, and also she's going to tell us more about possible policy solutions to the problems we've just been hearing about. Heather.
Thank you. Afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Monica. Thank you, Jan. I thought I was going to be the gloomy one on this panel. So I think you've beaten me to it. As Monica kindly introduced, I work for an organisation called the Work Foundation, and it's a think tank that's been trying to promote good work for over 100 years. So we were formed in the wake of the First World War, and since then we've been trying very hard, not me personally, but us as an organisation, to improve working practices. So it's through the lens of good work that I'm coming at this issue. And in particular, what I want to do is share some insight with you on what the emerging picture in the UK looks like, both in terms of trends that we're seeing, but most importantly, some of the policies that we're trying to deal with some of these issues. So starting with good work, I think Jan's done a lot of the work for me in terms of explaining what good work means. Thank you. So a lot of my work's been done here. I think generally we're on the same page, so we generally understand work. We look at it from a few different dimensions. So some of it's to do with the environment you work in, so you know how you're managed, how your performance managed, whether you have opportunities for learning and development, some of the structures and the team working, whether you feel you have a voice in that organisation. There are clearly some job factors like income and benefits, the hours you work, how your feelings as to job security and trust and influence and control, and clearly what you do on a day-to-day basis. There's these really important social factors, and I want to emphasise this, and I think Jan's slide did a huge amount of work for me here, because it, top of the list, I think, was around those interpersonal relationships. And I think they're absolutely crucial and are going to become even more so in the years ahead. And the only thing I wanted to really add is the subjectivity, actually, of good work. So what a good job is for one individual might mean something totally different to what it means for somebody else. So if you're a student working in retail during the Christmas break, you might be delighted with your retail job on the national living wage. But if you're somebody that lives in a low-income household, you're likely to be a good degree less so, because you struggle to pay the bills every month. So we're pretty much on the same page of good work. And what I wanted to do, to try and be positive, was to paint a bit of a picture of the land of the plenty. So genuinely, how do we think technology and digitalisation could impact good work? What's the potential here? And I think personally the potential is great. So we have the potential for smarter, more agile ways of working, for flatter management structures, for more agile teams formed around business problems that promote greater discretion and that ensure we get the best from the skills and the talent we have in businesses. We see some technologies actually acting positively to support communication in the workplace. And they have the potential to improve management practices, to strengthen employee voice, to promote engagement, and to empower employees to initiate workplace innovation. We see new models of learning, and I think we'll see lots more of this. For example, the use of immersive technologies that will bring experiential learning to a workplace. And that will help to overcome some of those challenges businesses face in terms of allowing their staff to take time off for learning. We have, and we see continually, smart digital technologies connected via networks being applied across all industries, ranging, operating factory production lines, transport and logistics centres, retail outlets, the construction site. There's no limit really to where we're seeing technology applied, and that has the potential to have dramatic effects on productivity. And as a lead-on, potentially, and I underline that point, wages, and that's really crucial. Some of the big data analytics techniques we see businesses deploy when they're trying to reach consumers could be deployed in the workplace to better understand what workers need, what matters to them, to help them better shape their benefits packages, to design workplaces in a way that fosters that interpersonal relationships that we spoke around. Some of the automation of routine tasks arguably could enrich roles, leaving behind those components that require very human skills and qualities, creativity, entrepreneurship, those really rewarding qualities. So there's a potential to increase work purpose. And social media and employee forums and networks could arguably support and strengthen communities of workers and better use them for support. So that's the prize. And the prize is great, isn't it? I mean, if that is what technology delivered for us, we would be delighted. But, unfortunately, to be the bearer of bad news, genuinely, we're failing to realise some of these benefits. And some of those challenges start with adoption. So, first and foremost, we are failing to see widespread adoption and effective deployment of technology within most businesses. And there will always have frontier businesses, those pioneers that take technology and apply it in these new and exciting ways. But the harsh reality is that innovation diffusion is really limited, and that's holding us back. In the UK, technology adoption, and this is the spider chart on the left, we fall behind our European counterparts in a range of areas. We're less good at using e-commerce, we're less good at enterprise resource planning technology, we don't use technology to better manage our people, and we're not using it to really strengthen our relationships and become smarter in the way we interact with our customers. So we're falling behind there. We recently did some work with Citrix, obviously a big technology provider itself. And despite the fact that both employees and businesses recognise the value of technology for productivity and performance, a little over half of businesses, a little over half, felt that they were genuinely technologically forward-thinking. And around 70% of employees that we spoke to said that they were not given the opportunity to work flexibly, remotely. And 15% still lack the technology to even do that. So half of it's around adoption and diffusion, and half of it's around how we blend technology with talent in the workplace. So it's hardly surprising that we're seeing this, we're not really realising the potential of technology. So it's no surprise and it's not new knowledge really that the UK has a productivity problem. But I would say I've never known a time where it's been so high up the agenda. And I think we've seen productivity flatline really since the economic downturn, and we have not seen it recover. Generally, rates of productivity are considerably lower in the UK, so it takes German workers 4 days to produce the same amount of GDP that British workers produce in 5. Pretty damning statistics. And we're doing lots of work, by brilliant academics, that, part of which sit on this panel, trying to get to the heart of what the issue is. Why are we struggling so much with productivity? And the key to that lies in how we manage our businesses. It lies in the working practices that we deploy. It lies in the steps we take, or rather we don't take, to get the best out of our businesses and our workforce. And directly linked to this is real wage growth, which has flatlined since the recession. So the nominal increases we've seen in earnings, in wages, have failed to keep pace with inflation. So when you look at productivity and its on the impact of technology on productivity and wages, we're not seeing that impact here now at all. The other issues we face growing issues at work. And I've got a few statistics I won't run through at length here for the sake of time, but I do really want to emphasise the challenges we face here in the quality of jobs we have. So the UK has more people in work than we have ever had before. We're doing brilliantly in terms of employment rates. We're nearly at full employment, which has for so long been a policy goal. But at the same time, we have almost unprecedented levels of in-work poverty. So that tells us a huge amount about the quality of jobs we're creating in our labour market. We've seen work intensity increase at the same time as underemployment. So around 12% of people working part-time want more hours, but can't get them. A shortage of talent is now one of the biggest challenges facing businesses, arguably alongside Brexit, which I'm going to avoid talking about at all costs today. And over 1 in 5 vacancies prove difficult to fill because there are the people in the labour market fundamentally lack the skills that businesses need. Despite this, businesses aren't investing in training their workforce, and less than 1 in 10 deploy what we might consider high-performance working practices. 1 in 10. That means 90% of businesses are not deploying high-performance working practices. And I think therein lies the root of the productivity problem in one statistic. We also have the issue of poor health in our workforce, and that's costing the economy dearly. So we have 1 in 3 of the working age population in England reporting having at least one long-term health condition. 1 in 8 report mental health conditions, and as we heard yesterday, that's the people that report mental health conditions. There's likely to be a whole swathe of people that don't. And this is having a huge impact. So estimates put this at around $100 billion to the UK economy. $100 billion because of lost time, absenteeism at work, poor levels of productivity. And that's equivalent, essentially, that would cover the cost of the NHS, the annual budget for the NHS. So we have some real issues. The other point we need to consider is the other part of the question, which is, will technology support good work for all? And when we start to look at some of the fantastic studies done by the OECD and others, and I would do my best to do justice to this, we can see there's going to be huge, huge differences in the way that this is going to play out. So firstly, those with basic skills aren't going to benefit from a huge amount of this shift. And then we're going to see falling demand for physical, mental, and basic cognitive skills, such as equipment operation, basic data input, basic literacy and numeracy. And in contrast, some of the higher cognitive skills, and this is the top right hand of the grid, this is a piece by McKinsey, they're the skills that are going to be in demand. And unsurprisingly, a lot of them are really human skills like creativity and entrepreneurship. So in short, the jobs gained from the opportunities that technology presents will look hugely different and will require very different skills to those that are lost. Now, unsurprisingly, this plays out sectorally, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the data here. But what we'll see is, while IT and business and professional services and health and education are likely to be least affected, other industries like hospitality, manufacturing, logistics, retail are going to be massively impacted by automation. And because of the spatial clustering of economic activity, we know there's going to be huge differences in which parts of our country are going to be significantly impacted by automation. And I just want to say 2 things about this chart. The first is that the areas that are going to be most significantly impacted by automation, and for those of you that aren't familiar with English geography, are the West Midlands, Yorkshire and Humber, and parts of the North East. And what you can see is that these, rather concerningly, are the parts of the UK that have the lowest levels of educational achievement and where employers typically offer less opportunities for work experience. So in short, the places that are less equipped to deal with automation are the most likely to feel its full force. And I think we all need to reflect on that. And what does that mean from a policy perspective? Well, I think generally, it calls for really active labour market skills and welfare policies. So what are we doing in the UK? Well, the good news is that good work is finally on the national agenda. So good work is an explicit priority at Whitehall. It's also a priority of the devolved governments in Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, who are all actively pursuing commissions or conventions around fair work. And that's great. That's real progress. Last year, we introduced a new industrial strategy, and this was focused around 5 foundations of productivity. The terminology shifted in years, but the principles are economic and haven't. And they include things like becoming very innovative, ensuring good jobs and greater power for all, and creating prosperous places across the UK. And another dimension is grand challenges. So we know that we need to make sure the UK benefits from the opportunities created by technology. So some of those grand challenges we're looking at the moment are AI and data, unsurprisingly, our ageing society, which is a massive concern for the UK, clean growth, and the future of mobility. In addition, we are working to build long-term strategic partnerships with businesses through what we call sector deals, and these really create a dialogue between industry and government, whereby they can identify where the opportunities are, where the barriers to growth are, how we can boost productivity, further collaboration, and ensure high-quality jobs. So we're taking a very strong sector approach. We're also reforming education, and this is a point I want to really end on. So the UK's been going through a big shift in terms of trying to improve our technical education, which has been underinvested for many years. And that includes strengthening technical qualifications and pathways, strengthening opportunities to earn while you learn through apprenticeships, including a new apprenticeship levy, which just has mixed success, and we can pick up in the Q&A if you're interested. We are starting to get to grips with the shift. So we've introduced Union Learn, which is a training program that works through unions to improve learning in the workplace. And we are literally in the midst of designing a national retraining program with the express purpose of helping people to navigate the challenge of automation to ensure a higher wage future. Finally, there's a huge amount of work being done locally. Unsurprisingly, Whitehall is busy. So a lot of our activity is actually operating through cities and city regions to test and trial local industrial strategies, to develop skills advisory panels, and to promote digital skills partnerships in order to promote local competitive advantage, support a rebalancing, and that's really important, of the UK economy, and to promote prosperous places in the face of this new digital age. I will stop there. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Heather. And thank you all for being such disciplined speakers. It's wonderful, because that means that our audience will have time to ask questions and follow up on the many interesting points you're making. It's very reassuring to see that government in the UK is doing things, and maybe we'll have some chance to discuss later what else they should be doing, or what are the most common mistakes. I think that's a... Since Jan told us so intensely that it's now and we have no time to lose, it also means that all the governments and policymakers really do have to hit the ground running, and I think that's one of the biggest problems here. We're going to hear about how the Korean government is reacting to these big changes. As we've heard many times now, in our host country here, that is at the forefront of digital change. Together with Estonia, you are the leaders among OECD countries of having embraced digitalization very early on. So it'll be very interesting to hear your perspective. Our speaker is Hur Jae-jun. He is a senior research fellow at the Employment Policy Research Division in the government think tank here, the Korea Labor Institute, which I'm sure many of you know, very renowned institute, and we look forward to your presentation, Jae-jun.
Well, I'm happy to be here to share Korean experience. Well, actually, Korean government is not doing many things, but there are many discussions, so I will share this information with you. Well, I just try to, okay. Well, Jan told about some scary figures, but I have to start with a survey result, which shows probably the subjective level of well-being of many countries. Well, everywhere in the world, the future of work is a big issue today. And, journalists frequently report that AI-integrated robots and computers will not deprive us of jobs, but people are still concerned with that. Those AI technology will take their jobs away. Well, no matter what type of job they have, people continue to ask, will my job survive? Well, as many as in, like in other countries, as many as 75% of Koreans are concerned with that AI technology will eventually take their jobs. But only 14% say that they are preparing themselves for this challenge of digitalization. Well, it is true. Well, it is true that digital technology is changing, is making disruptive changes. It has enabled new business models, new production process, goods and services, and so on. Only a few firms are providing opportunities for workers to develop their careers, to meet the challenges. Well, does this is it a reason for us to continue a long-term pessimistic outlook? Well, there are many technologies which represent digital transformation. Today, I think among them, the autonomous cars are a good example for our discussion. When we listen to the futurists, they predict that the auto industry will shrink and become subordinate to car leasing companies in the future. And self-driving cars will make obsolete the driver's jobs, but also it threatens the jobs of insurance agents or traffic analysts or claims adjusters. But futurists also predict that the auto industry will, that this technology will not make drivers, this one side, the long-term forecast overlooks much in between evolution. Well, it is based on the assumption that the total number of miles traveled by the cars in the economy remain constant, even though the network utilization rate of cars increase with the development of autonomous cars. Well, autonomous with the diffusion of autonomous cars, the utilization rate of cars will increase. However, people will travel more than they do, travel more than they do now, and the mileage, the total number of travel miles will increase dramatically in the future. If this is true, jobs in the auto industry and those in related industries, for example, insurance companies, will also change rather than disappear. Though technological changes may seem disruptive, they won't eliminate all tasks of our jobs. And we may find, if we are willing, time or opportunities for a smooth transition from one task to another. Well, in Korea, with the increase of online transactions, the growth of permanent contract workers is decreasing. while the growth of single self-employed, the growth of single self-employed is accelerating. A third of workers have been employed as on non-permanent contract basis, and a quarter of workers are low-wage workers. Well, with the digitalization, non-standard type of employment, more non-standard type of employment have appeared. In Korea, like in other OECD countries, the middle skilled workers, the proportion of middle skilled workers has diminished over the last 2 decades. But the change was mainly due to the first decade. The change in the second decade is not explained fully by the technological factors alone. So, I think it's better explained by some labor supply factors, as like enrollment rate, and also globalization factor of globalization of a production base of Korean firms to other developing countries. Well, in Korea, there are fields where positive changes are being made, where stakeholders are adapting to the new environment that digitalization demands. On the other hand, there are fields in which changes are very sluggish, and even though the need for change is indispensable and urgent. Well, you see among these brands, there are Inuma, of which the booth I could find in the second floor of this building, and I have with that. That's one of the typical social ventures rooted in Seongsu-dong area in Seoul. And also Model Labs, which is problem-solving labs. And Awesome School is a learning lab. Now, more than 100 schools have participating in the program. The camp is an accelerator, and the impact-based camp is also accelerating program. Well, some large firms, startups, some ventures, project-oriented problem-solving labs are rapidly adapting to new possibilities which workers can piggyback onto. But we see a sluggish or little adjustment in the official education system, outdated and complicated labor market regulations, and the employment relations which fail to respect social partners' autonomy. An overwhelming number of SMEs remain in low productivity trap, waiting for new entrepreneurship, which everybody thinks is the essential in creating jobs. Well, to overcome job and income insecurity and unemployment, especially technological unemployment nowadays, it is necessary to adjust labor market regulations and the social protection system in order to meet the demands of the digital era where we live now. Many know that workplace cooperation as well as social coordination is important in coping with new challenges, but this is an area in which we have hardly seen any meaningful progress. Meanwhile, there are many discussions going on regarding how to protect the non-traditional contract workers. Also, how to regulate the working time. And also, we are groping for new arrangements for to improve the existing rigid labor regulations. And in the meantime, non-contribution-based benefit programs are expanding, such as unemployment assistance with training services and the basic pension benefits. Well, even though all these efforts are currently taking place, the fear of job insecurity or income loss persists. Perhaps this is understandable because we have done much. But however, we must believe that all the changes occurring because of digitalization are only transitional, and that we'll succeed in overcoming the challenges in the end. Our task will be different, perhaps in 5 years, and far more different in 10 or 20 years. But it's certain we'll have eventually more and better jobs. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jae-Jun. It's nice to end on such a happy note. Now, I would like to open immediately the floor to the audience to see if you share this optimistic view, if you have questions on well-being, on policy examples, on alchemy in the tech sector, and not working? Then maybe I'll take this one. So please raise your hands if you would like to ask questions. And we have some here. Do we have a microphone? Let's start with the lady here, then Alan, and then the lady here.
Thank you. Thank you. First of all, thank you so much for this wonderful panel. Very interesting and also very thought-provoking. I was interested in all of the four presenters, but I don't know how to put this together. So I kind of tried to frame one question, which maybe all of you can help me understand this better. All of this, at least from what I understand, is also to build a more, it's not just well-being, it's also a resilient society in which these externalities, some are within our control, some are not. Some are psychological, as how I'm seeing it from some of you, and some are actually real physical challenges. So I was wondering if, the countries that are speaking here are mostly countries who are highly industrialized. And I come from a country that is not fully industrialized. So two implications here is, in countries where we are not predominantly industrialized, we still have a very strong agriculture and also a very strong service-driven economy, perhaps not as sophisticated. That's one. Two, is it possible that in terms of resiliency and how well-being is going to be defined, that we also need to look at the social, cultural aspect of it, from more masculine society versus more feminine society? And lastly, in terms of inequalities, I guess I'd like to know, I'm sure there are more than degrees of just income and opportunities. Are inequalities also psychological inequalities that affects productivity in a big sense? And is there a critical, I guess, a critical threshold where it becomes impossible for society to adapt, and whether we can actually, I don't know, find some sort of policy, as you were saying, policy, social protection. So I think for governments, our role is really to find something to help society become more resilient. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take maybe two more questions and then pass it on. So, Alan?
Yep. Monica, you should stop me straight away because I came in late, and it may be that my question has already been answered. But as Jan was leaving on a gloomy note, I just have two rather quick questions. The first is about identity, that historically people have been identified with the work they do. So from Epictetus, who said the lyre player is known because he's the lyre player, the baker is known because he's the baker. In Wales, people were called Jones the bread, or things like this. And now, what some of my colleagues say, no problem, what we do is guarantee you employment, but not necessarily your job. And it's not clear to me that that solves that problem. And not just because of the change in wages and so forth, but because that's somehow an intrinsic part of you. And my second question is that Air France was announcing with some satisfaction that they had rather better profits now than recently. And they then negotiated wages for the employees and basically resisted almost any claim to any increase on the grounds that this would increase our costs and therefore reduce our competitivity. But if you treat your employees as costs, you know, is it surprising that they're not very productive? If you tell the people who are actually producing the things that they're just costs for the firm, and particularly when they see what management gets paid, is that not a little bizarre?
And just maybe behind you, and then
Thank
we'll
you.
open.
Thank you. My name is Hind. I come from Dubai, United Arab Emirates, and I work for a government organization that overlooks education. I just want to thank all the speakers for the generosity of information they've been sharing with us, because with every presentation, you've touched a particular pain point that we are facing at the moment. And I also want to share our experience when it comes to operating in a changing world, and that is quite vague to us. What we've been embracing is experimenting and embracing failure as well. So as a governance model within organization, we've been experimenting a lot. We're focusing on autonomy, that's one thing, and we're focusing on well-being as well. So I mean, it's an invitation. Whenever you are visiting UAE, Dubai, I'll give you my business card. Please give me a call, and I'll invite you over to see what we're doing. Thank you.
I think I'm going to give we'll collect the next round afterwards, but maybe just the first three questions. We have well-being resilient societies, in particular, what are the correct measures for less developed countries, the relationship between work and identity, and profits, wages, and productivity. And yeah, I think that's it. So who would like to go first? Jan? Heather?
Maybe on the first point.
Okay, so taking the points in that order briefly, and I'll elaborate more on those that are very much closer to some of the work that I've been doing. I think the key point that you raised was actually kind of the first and the last things that you said, which was, is it government's job to promote a resilient society? And I absolutely think, particularly given everything we've stood up and said and everything we've heard in the last 2 days and everything we do as part of our day-to-day jobs, that resilience is absolutely what we need to focus on. But actually, I think resilience previously has spoken around the definition of resilience as being relatively narrow in the context of the global downturn. So we've talked around economic resilience. So how do we bounce back from shocks? That's not what this is at all. What I really believe we need to do is build agility. We need to build agility within our businesses. We need to build agility within our workers. And that all takes investment. And coming to your point around social protection, I think that's probably the one area we didn't touch on, but I'm really pleased that you brought it up. Because it is really likely that some of these trends, and digitalisation in particular, will play out really differently for different groups. So I mentioned different sectors, I mentioned people with different skill levels, I mentioned spatially different areas. The point I didn't pick up on mostly for the sake of time was the impact it will have on different socio-demographic groups. And you mentioned women particularly. And I think the evidence is quite interesting in this regard. So I think what I've seen has highlighted that previously women have kind of missed the first part of the automation shift because it's been very manufacturing orientated. But when we look forward, we're talking around automating some of those service orientated roles in retail, for example, and hospitality, and women are very prevalent there. So a lot of the statistics I've seen suggest women, for example, could be disproportionately impacted. I don't think we're having enough of a narrative around the kind of social implications of the trends that we're seeing. To your point about identity, just quickly, because I know you were going to pick up on this. Yes, we've previously been defined very closely by what we do. You only have to introduce yourself to somebody, and one of the second things out of your mouth past your name is what you do for a living. I'm delighted that we're moving away from describing who we are, and I really embrace by the jobs that we do, and I really embrace some of the commentary I've heard over the last 2 days around recognising and better acknowledging the wider contribution we make to society. So I hope that that will feature as part of the discussion. And as to the UAE point around experimentation and embracing failure, yes, this is exactly what we need to do. And these challenges are global. I mean, genuinely they are. And we're testing stuff in the UK. And I'm really pleased here to tell you a bit about what we're trying. I don't know if they're going to work. A lot of it's quite new. And I'd love to know what you're trying in UAE. So next time I'm there, I'll pop in.
On the second point as well, and this we may actually differ of opinion here on the identity, but so this makes it all the more interesting. It's very fashionable to say we can't guarantee job security. We're moving to, but we can guarantee employment security, which puts at question, at risk, the identity, because people have to change their professional identities, which is difficult, or at least breaks from the dual traditions. I've heard another version of this, which is even worse, which is we can't guarantee job security, we can't guarantee employment security, but we can guarantee you universal basic income. That is interesting, it's better than nothing, but it completely undermines the aspects, the non-pecuniary aspects associated with having a job, and reduces a job to a transactional thing, which is just to be your time in exchange for a paycheck. And so what we find, obviously, and this will not, I mean, this is very intuitive to everyone, but the pay, as you saw from our analysis, is not unimportant, but it's only one aspect amongst many others. And in fact, it's not even the most, it's not by far not the most important one. It's the quality of the job, the interestedness, the interpersonal relations around it, the social capital, and so on and so forth. So generally speaking, a job provides you identity, provides you network, provides you identity, thus respect, provides a routine throughout the day. So much more than just a paycheck attached to it. So, but on the specific point, from job security to employment security, and this is interesting, we differ here. So I think it's easier said than done. What you're hinting at is sort of a fluid identity, where people need to be accepting of the fact that they can, from a baker, become, I don't know, an automobile construction or assembly. And I think that's easier said than done. I think people's identities are quite engraved quite quickly, and they hold on to that, and it gives them a certain status. But you seem to indicate something else, which I hadn't thought of before, which is it's not just fluid identities, it's also other meaningful contributions to society beyond just associated with a specific job. And you're probably also thinking of gender differences there. So that I hadn't considered at all. But generally speaking, identity is pretty solid, and I think move from job security to employment security undermines the non-pecuniary benefits and aspects of well-being of identity. And so it's not necessarily a positive for well-being.
I'll pick on just a couple of your points from each of you. So on identity, since we just left off with Jan, it's interesting you brought that up, because one of the things that I talk a lot about is the disconnect between speeds. One is the speed of technological change, and the other is speed of how we think about ourselves. And that's where the identity piece comes in. And as the nature of jobs change, and as a truck driver may be displaced by an automated logistics company, do we expect this driver to retrain to become a programmer? Right, so there is a little bit of a leap there, and it's been touched on by a lot of the presentations, right, that it's not necessarily one for one. The jobs replace, you can get into the ones that are created, not to mention the difference in numbers there. So I think the bigger paradigm shift here is actually around this concept of the sanctity of toil. In many, many cultures, we attribute human worth to how hard you work. You know, yes, the grain of the salt, I don't know what they call it in America, salt of the earth people who like work the factory floors and who build the cars and who pave the roads. You know, even though they're talking about blue-collar workers, they say it with this pride, right? And it's because of the sanctity of toil. And the most derision is for lazy, idle people who are doing good-for-nothing things, you know, with their time. So this throws up a very interesting conundrum, which is that if a significant enough percentage of jobs or tasks available are automated, then you will necessarily, you may not have, so to Jan's point earlier in his presentation, that it's not necessarily you'll have like 80% of people suddenly don't have jobs. I don't think the picture is so black and white like that, but it may be more of that 33% of the tasks you do in your job are now done by something else, and so your wages have decreased, or that you have to find another job, this kind of stuff. It's a little bit more nuanced, and there's a great report out as well, in addition to those great studies. I want to get my hands on them, by McKinsey Global Institute again, but it's a different report, jobs lost, jobs gained. And they gave this like interesting statistic of like 33%. So it's not the number itself, but it's the idea that some of your work, of your normal 9-hour day or your 10 or 12, depending on how hard your company works you, may be replaced, right? So then you have this issue potentially of underemployment going on. And so then how do we see people who have more time on their hands? And so this isn't even yet touching on social protections, if we have universal basic income, the rosy utopian picture that a lot of the technological optimists say, or as Charles Seaman likes to say, the wizards, the prophets and the wizards. The wizards have this like the dreams that technology can help us solve all problems. And then so will technology help us introduce an era of leisure? Humans can finally now be freed up to pursue the art and the music and the theater and like all these things that are, you know, some people argue the most human of endeavors. And that requires a massive shift in our attitude about toil, and like you have to work to be a worthy human. So that's one. Yes. Okay, let's hurry up. So I want to touch on the lady's question about resilience and in developing countries. So just a very quick point on that is that historically the path to development has been traditionally production and industrialization through factories, manufacturing, right? You have manufacturing, and so you have all this employment, and then you get rich, or get richer. But now it seems like we may face a phenomenon that economist Danny Roderick has called premature industrialization. That means you're skipping the factories and going straight to services, but then the employment path, the employment benefit, employment gains are not the same. So then how do countries that are not yet industrialized or less industrialized deal with that kind of, you know, you've kind of lost that ladder in going up the economic or the OECD chain. So that's kind of like a bigger problem than just automation and resilience. Of course, that's going to be key. And maybe an interesting question would be, how does your society, by the way, where are you from? Thailand. So in Thailand, there's this great concept of self-sufficiency that I love, and there's so much to be learned from that wisdom. And I think actually many different cultures have their native wisdoms of what makes their community strong, right? And maybe this is a time to revisit some of these old wisdoms and draw the strengths from it that we've sort of learned to put behind our minds as we automate our hyper-productive lives. Yeah, I mean, sorry, that's probably not a satisfactory answer, but finding strength in community, I think that's my...
So I think culture, and you put it quite rightly, is that to find that core. Yeah, that's all. It's like, so culture promotes peace and security, as UNESCO's a lot of research have actually shown us that without this element, really, it doesn't bond with anything else. So I think at the end of the day, it's not just a sense of well-being, but towards what? I mean, sense of well-being needs to have meaning, and I think it comes down to culture. At least this is how we interpret it in my culture. So I was looking for that in this forum for that. I was just exchanging views with a few other countries, and yeah, we was kind of wondering if there is a place in this framework.
Well, maybe I can just quickly step in here before we take a next round of questions, because there's several people here. There's two here who would like to ask questions. And just on the point of culture, the OECD indeed is working on almost everything except defense and culture. And yeah, so, but of course we cannot, and you put your finger exactly there where it hurts, in a sense. We cannot ignore this because it is constituent for social capital. And if we talk about well-being, then we have to talk about culture as well. But we've perhaps been interpreting this a bit narrowly in the sense of, you know, the fine arts and so on, that we don't work on that particular part of the economy. Perhaps we should. We need to have our member countries ask us to do this. But we should definitely think of culture as the cement that keeps societies together and work on it in that sense. And now the floor is yours. You've been waiting for a long time.
I'll be very short. I mean, we've been talking about digitalization, and it's basically a technological change phenomena. But at the same time, there are other things happening in the labor market, which one other important thing is the increase in globalization, international trade, and the movement of the production lines. I mean, I'd like to hear from the speakers here, what do they believe, how these things interact? I mean, perhaps the lack of growth in wages or this negativity instinct has also to do with this other phenomena, that it's probably intertwined with what you've been saying.
We have another question there. We'll collect a few questions again.
네, 저는 한국어로 하겠습니다. 저는 새로운 기술이 I can speak English, okay? Yeah. I'm wondering what the impact of the new technology on gender relations in workplace, because I studied the effect of the prescription, online prescription on hospital workplace. So I interviewed some nurses, and then they said because of the new technology, they will suffer more. I asked them whether that kind of new technology make you more free or more flexible, but then only doctors actually benefit from that. Doctors, within 24 hours, anytime they can just give us the prescription, but we have to wait, when doctor actually give us the prescription, so that because of that they have to stay there maybe more than for the whole day. Before, in the past they just expected the doctors just give us a prescription during his work time, but nowadays the nurse become more just controlled by the kind of the prescription, and the doctors only can benefit. So we have to think about the kind of a gender balance. It should be, I don't know, but technology can improve, or maybe technology can yeah, that's my question. I think you got point.
And here's another one.
I have two questions. The first one is really quick one for Jan. The data you showed us about the drivers of, let me see, the job satisfaction. I'm wondering, does the data speak for all members of the OECD the countries, or does it speak for some more developing countries? Like I see some independencies, but some people from underdeveloped countries are willing to kind of trade those job security for, the independence for job security. So that's my first question. And the second one is about, I'm wondering about all the speakers, how do you foresee the impact, possible impact of digitalization on the relocation of global talents? I see from the last two speakers at the national government level, you are trying to foresee this uncertain future and trying to make plans at the national level. But what we've been seeing so far is the influx of, maybe in case of Korea, we see a lot of immigrant workers for some of the 3D industries where no Koreans want to more. I mean, there is some scarcity of finding talents. So when there's a mismatch, you can always rely upon foreign workforces. But at the same time, I see some of you mentioned about the impact of digitalization is not equal for high level the skill population versus low or medium skill level. So do you see the digitalization is going to expedite some of the, even now is the workforce or the skill level is unequal already, but do you think this digitalization is going to globally kind of make this inequality even further or deeper?
Okay, now we had three more questions, actually 4 more questions. So I think that we'll make this the closing round now. And so to give the chance to everybody to make their final remarks in addressing these questions. So Jae-jun, maybe you want to start?
I'm not sure that I could cover all of those issues, but okay. Well, regarding the first question, how the technology and globalization is intertwined. Well, I think that the technological progress is simplified as the process. Make complicated works as simple. So usually people tend to do a simpler task than before when automation is going on. So in this way, the productivity increases. So once, whether it is digitalization or others, automation is already made. I think the firms, they would like to move their production lines to probably at cheaper places. But not always these factors just function. Because let's take an example of Samsung Electronics. Actually, when Samsung established a big cell phone company in Vietnam, actually Samsung could establish it in Korea. But we didn't have enough those middle-skilled workers at the time. If Samsung established that factory in Korea, probably all the SMEs in Korea could not find any high school graduate students for their factories, for example. So sometimes labor supply factor functions more than technological factors, I think. Well, we can continue a deeper discussion later. But regarding the second question on gender issues in a hospital, I think for the moment that's true that when technology is introduced to one factory or workplace, usually the high-end workers benefit the most from the technology, because usually autonomy is given to high-skilled workers, and those middle or low-skilled workers has just less autonomy, so they had a less margin to maneuver in a workplace. But in the long run, I think the process of job polarization cannot last for long. I think someday in the future, I don't know, it's in 5 years or 10 years, but there will be entrepreneurs, I think, who find that those middle-skill labor courses is so cheap, and organize the workplace using more middle-skilled workers, and he can make a big business. Well, probably at the time the situation will be different from now, I think. Yeah. Well, that's the one clue I can give you for the moment. And the further discussion can be, I think, yes, true, push that. I think rest of questions probably to other, yes.
For the sake of time, I'll just pick up on the gender point and just elaborate on that slightly. I mentioned a bit before around how technology could genuinely impact women in a negative way moving forwards. But one thing I didn't emphasise that I will do now is that the bigger issue here is around structural labour market barriers that women face in terms of progression. So, you know, in the UK, we're focused a lot around the gender pay gap. So women earn less more for the same jobs than men, and we know that's not right. Building on that, there's a huge occupational driver here too. So we have far less women in senior roles, you know, FTSE 250 companies, sure, but beyond that, most businesses, you know, women comprise a much smaller part of senior teams. Building on that further, there's occupational segregation. So we find women working in more junior roles, more service-orientated industries. So my view on this is that, yes, we absolutely need to tackle, and in a very active, much more active way than we're doing right now, some of the challenges that digitalisation and other trends will impact on our labour market. But we also need to not forget the structural issues that we face. And I think the solution to the gender issue is to tackle the underlying structural ones, not to necessarily build policies that focus on women transition in the face of trends, but let's address the underlying issues that we've been dealing with for generations.
I'll address two quick points. First, I wouldn't have expected this question, but it's interesting to think about the globalization of production in a way to try and learn lessons or draw lessons from it, from how to deal with this sort of big revolution in the way we do work. It's interesting that we had Joe Stiglitz around these last 2 days, because I think he's got his Nobel Prize for the work he did in the 80s and the 90s, where he anticipated the impact of international trade and a global production system. And what was clear is that on balance, it's a very positive, in fact, has brought about 1 billion people worldwide, mostly China and India, out of extreme poverty. But within countries, there would be a group of people, what he called the abundant resources, the abundant, who would not benefit from these trades. So there's elements in each society that have seen decreases in their material and psychological well-being. And so obviously in the case of, say, America or the West, it's obviously the low-skilled workers have seen their wages set by essentially workers in China and pressures in those ways. And my sense is, even though that was perfectly anticipated, probably in seminars like this, around the 80s and the 90s, that increasing globalization would be good, but would put pressures on low to medium skilled. We're doing the same thing now about the future of work, which will really hit us in, say, 5 to 10 to 20 years. And yet then we're thinking about how can we already anticipate some of this and do active labor market policies to make sure people can transition, et cetera, et cetera. In a way, if there's one thing where the economists seem to be on a consensus, is that it'll be good for the high-skilled, and it won't be so good for low to medium-skilled individuals, this digitalization in the future of work. So again, in a way, the exact same groups will be vulnerable once again. And so the question is, can we, the gains from digitalization through, for the top end and productivity in general for society, how can we at least get some of that back and make that help those who will not necessarily win from this next revolution? So I think it's interesting to think of that as less, and we should, the lessons learned, or the lessons that we didn't learn last time, can we do better this time around? So that's one interesting. Yeah, just on the quick technical question. So we run this analysis on 2 data sets. One is the European Social Survey, and the other one is the International Social Survey Program. And so it's mostly OECD nations for which this holds. On this particular graph about the drivers of job satisfaction, there's a number of developing countries in there. When we look at those in a bit more detail, it's things that you may expect. The physicality, the safety and security of these jobs suddenly becomes a bit more important as a driver. So the more insecure and unsafe the job is, the more it hits well-being. On the negative front, needless to say. And so these aspects become, but otherwise it's surprisingly systematic. The drivers of what makes people happy in their jobs are quite universal.
Final word, Bernice, and our organizers just told us to
Yes, okay.
close very quickly.
Okay, so I'll just add one tiny point, because these guys have already answered like the bulk of the key issues to the questions you guys raised. So one quick one on the localization of talent, which Yen just talked about. So it's partly, one extra element is mobility. So I think that's one dimension on which, you know, you see who will have and who will have not, right? Which are the people or which are the families that are able to go to Silicon Valley to like take up the, you know, sexy programming AI job, and who are more bound, either because they have other responsibilities or they do not have the means to make such moves, which then raises interesting policy questions of whether multilateral agreements could be created to protect workers that suffer the blunt end of the stick. I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of, I think, possible policy innovation on that front. And then just a quick one on gender. So it's interesting that a lot of the discussion has been that technology will negatively impact women. And as I was touching on in my presentation, I think there is a possibility for women to benefit, but it takes a very big leap, and that leap is a change in our accounting systems. The reason why a lot of the unrecognized labor, emotional labor, care that women provide, which are unrecognized, are unrecognized. That's the whole point. It's like they don't show up in our GDP, they don't show up in our accounting systems. And so obviously, how do we value them, right? So then this is kind of like a rethink of like, what are those metrics, or how do we like count these things? And then if we say that these things are part of the worth and the value that you provide to your company, to your organization, then we can find ways to account for that. And then that could change the way women are regarded. And I hope this will actually no longer be a women discussion, because it will be work. It will be work that is good for all.
Great final word. So let me thank our panel. That was really a fascinating discussion, and also thank the audience for participating so actively. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. And the discussion can continue both here and in the future, because the good news is the future of work is something that is going to keep us very busy in the future. And at the OECD and together with you, we would really like to continue this dialogue. So thank you very much, and have a lovely evening.